Time now for our daily digest of one of the main news stories, and today we're going to turn our attention to Colombia. Ivan Duque is being sworn in there as president. The 42-year-old is known for his close ties to former head of state Álvaro Uribe. Duque takes over a country with a long to-do list when it comes to stamping out corruption and decreasing the divisions between the country's rich and poor. Here's a quick look at the challenges that lie ahead.
At 42 years old, Ivan Duque is Colombia's youngest president. Yet many of the problems he inherits are much older than he is. He's promised to unite the country, which is still scarred by 5 decades of armed conflict with left-wing rebels.
The peace we all dream of demands corrections, so that victims are the true center of the process, and so that there is justice and reparation, but no repetition.
Duque has vowed to overhaul the historic 2016 peace accord with the FARC, which guarantees rebels seats in Congress and allows them to contest in elections. He's described the deal as a joke, saying he will impose tougher punishments on crimes committed by FARC leaders.
There will be no amnesty for drug trafficking and political crimes. The eradication of coca plantations will be mandatory. Concealing weapons and cash will become a criminal act. This means that FARC leaders will no longer benefit from the peace accord.
Duque's tough stance on guerrilla groups is in line with that of his mentor, Álvaro Uribe, who was president between 2002 and 2010. Peace in Colombia, however, remains fragile. The FARC have disarmed, but other rebel groups, notably the National Liberation Army or ELN, are still active. Duque will face no shortage of security challenges. Drug trafficking is on the rise again, and cocaine production is booming in areas previously controlled by the FARC. Economically, Duque is viewed as business-friendly. He's vowed to tackle corruption and slash taxes, saying he will govern with and for all Colombians. Yet the gap between rich and poor remains wide. Despite recent growth, Colombia remains the second most unequal country in Latin America.
Well, indeed, part of the major issues is that 2016 peace deal with FARC, which, as we just heard there, Duque in the past described as a joke. And indeed, during his campaign for president, he promised to rewrite it. Well, let's get some guests on to tell us exactly what he might do now that he's being inaugurated. Our guests are Raul Agalos, Associate Director of Control Risks, a specialist risk consultancy based in Bogota. Thanks for your time. And also joining us from Colombia's Jose Miguel Santamaria, a political analyst there and also a member of the Democratic Centre Party, which is the same party as the new president. Let me start perhaps with your good self, Mr. Santamaria. You know, this man, he campaigned in a bid to change that peace deal with the FARC. Now that he's in power, will he?
Okay, hello everybody who is listening and seeing these programs. I'm very proud of being here. The first thing that I want to say is that it's not that Ivan Duque wants to eliminate the peace project and all these things. He only wants to change some things that he thinks they are not equal for everyone. And these things that he wants to change, I think most of the Colombians wants to change. They don't want to see some of these guys to be in the Congress without having passed by the justice, and we don't want to see them in the Congress without see what they done before.
But of course, that deal was signed with those FARC rebels. They're unlikely to be open to any changes, notably anything that gets them out of office.
Yes, but the problem is that there was a plebiscito in 2016 that the plebiscito says that the people wants a different kind of peace and a different kind of things in the peace. And that's what Ivan Duque wants to change.
Notably, I believe, bringing them through the court system. Well, Mr. Miguel Santamaria, do stay with us, of course, but let me bring in our other guest, Raul Gallegos. Mr. Gallegos, now you work for a control risk company. How do you see this idea of re-examining the peace process, which took quite a long time to negotiate in the first place? Is there a danger to that?
Well, no, I certainly think that, the country is very much divided over this, and for good reason. I think Colombians have been through this before. They have seen situations where agreements have been struck with armed actors, only to see a number of armed actors, get away with reduced sentences, get away with, to some degree, a level of impunity, and a number of these actors return to, taking up arms against the government or engage in other types of illegal activity. So certainly the frustration is natural. And this is a country that you must understand is very conservative in its politics and has been for many, many years. And a number of, Colombians are also nervous about the ideology of some of these actors coming into politics, which very much jives with the ideology of the Venezuelan government, which we have next door, and we've seen the results of that. So I think that what we're seeing right now, there's certainly a risk of further polarization if some of these elements of the agreement are changed. But you have to understand that Duque was elected, in all fairness, with that mandate. It's true that the contender Petro won 8 million votes, and that is certainly a very considerable level of votes for a leftist candidate here in Colombia. But the winner was Duque. So in our view, certainly what we expect to see is Duque to roll up his sleeves and make changes to the peace agreement that will be, no doubt, controversial. But that is what a larger chunk of the population here voted him to do. Mr.
Gallegos, before I move on slightly, how do you see the peace deal so far? Since it was brought in, from the outside we're being told, well, actually, okay, the FARC have handed in their weapons and that, that ended decades of bloody warfare, but peace hasn't really come yet, has it?
Well, no. I mean, in all fairness, that was an agreement with the FARC, which was the largest guerrilla group here in Colombia, and it has been for over 50 years. But you still have the ELN. You still have a number of criminal organizations that are splinter groups of either drug trafficking organizations or splinter groups of the guerrilla groups themselves that engage in kidnapping, engage in illegal mining, and in drug trafficking. So the idea that somehow this peace agreement will bring full peace to the country is frankly disingenuous. I mean, there is very much an armed conflict raging with a number of different groups that have influence over a whole swath of the country. There is certainly an issue of reestablishing security to a number of areas in the country, bringing about the conditions for business to flourish and growth to flourish. So certainly, this
peace deal isn't going to be all.
There's still very much a whole conflict.
Mr. Gallegos, I will come back to you in just a few minutes, but I'm being told we have another guest available, Miss Cynthia Arns, Director of Latin American Program at the Woodrow Wilson International Center in Washington. Thanks for joining us and being with us. I don't know if you were able to hear the start of our conversation here, but just looking at the inauguration of that new President Ivan Duque, and he campaigned on that promise to rewrite some of the peace agreement, at least some of it, with the FARC. How do you see that idea? Is that a necessary move, as the other guests are suggesting?
Well, I think that there's been a real evolution in the public position that Ivan Duque has taken. He was most certainly, as the other guests have indicated, opposed to provisions of the agreement that were seen as far too lenient in terms of transitional justice, in terms of not contemplating time in prison for members of the FARC who had committed terrible crimes or crimes against humanity. And I think his position has modified to a certain extent. And if you look at recent statements, what he seems to be saying is that people from the FARC who have been convicted of war crimes should not be allowed to be or to take a seat in the Congress until they have served their sentence. I think that this is an issue that reverberates and resonates with Colombians, and it would be not surprising at all to see that kind of modification, presented by the Duque administration. That said, whatever changes in the accord might be introduced will be subject to constitutional challenges before the Constitutional Court, because there was another ruling that said that the peace accord does not just apply to the Santos administration, but for the next 12 years to sort of shield it from the changes under a different president. So whatever is approved in Congress, if such a provision is approved, will be challenged before the Constitutional Court.
Well, on that note, let me bring back in Mr. Miguel Santamaria. On that note, Mr. Miguel Santamaria, a bid to change, but exactly how easy will that be? Is it a mission impossible in many ways?
Yes, it's going to be very difficult, but also we have to say that the peace, when you want the peace, you just don't have to sign it and no more, because there's no peace like that. We have a lot of problems additionally in the country that President Duque has to change. And one of them is the drug traffic, because the drug traffic is the first step of the delinquency and all the things that happens to Colombia.
Absolutely.
So
and Mr. Miguel Santamaria, the question then is, we're often hear that this new president is a protege, if you like, of a former head of state, Álvaro Uribe. He went down the road of a pretty severe military crackdown to try and eradicate the drug trafficking. It didn't work. What do you expect from this new president?
Sorry, but I don't think that, because when in the government of Álvaro Uribe, the drug trafficking go a lot of less than is now. The problem is that this government, the government of Juan Manuel Santos, let the drug traffickers stay like in house because he wants to sign the peace deal, yes,
okay,
and he didn't care about the drug traffic. Now we have a very good problem because we have this drug traffic in an enormous manner.
Absolutely. Well, let me ask Ms. Arneson perhaps to give us an idea of this drug trafficking. Of course, it's a massive problem, and one that the US has been hoping Colombia would start to concentrate on cocoa crops higher than ever, more widespread than ever, but an incredibly difficult thing to try and get a hand on this, this idea of paying farmers to change from the cocoa crop to other production. But they say that that's simply too expensive.
Right. Well, as you mentioned, coca cultivation in Colombia is at an all-time historic high, over 200,000 hectares of coca, and this is a vast increase from the time of even more than when Plan Colombia began. I think the peace accord had some elements that were actually quite innovative, and if they had been implemented properly, could actually have worked. The idea was not just to have forced eradication, but also to provide for sustainable livelihoods for peasant farmers of coca. This involves a vast investment in rural areas in Colombia, not only to create alternative crops that are marketable and commercially viable, but also create the kind of rural infrastructure that would allow farmers in these remote areas to have a sustainable livelihood. And I think what has happened is that the implementation has lagged. The ability to get farmers to engage in voluntary eradication is way behind target. And there is undoubtedly going to be an increase in forced eradication under the new government of Ivan Duque.
Now, Ms. Arneson, you mentioned there the cost as well of getting farmers to change crops. I believe because they are being offered financial compensation for that. I believe I read one estimate that it would cost up to $500 million a year for the Colombian government if the tens of thousands of farmers in those cocoa crop growing regions actually signed up. That's a lot of money for the government to pay out. Does it need international help? I know the US, you mentioned the Plan Colombia there. The US has spent billions since the year 2000 trying to get things to move there. Is it going to continue? Because the new administration has been echoing the idea of slashing funding.
Well, there has long been, I think for the last 15 to 17 years, bipartisan support in the U.S. Congress, Democrats as well as Republicans, for a robust program of assistance to Colombia. The purpose of that obviously changed to a certain degree with the signing of the peace agreement. And Congress, at least for these last 2 years, both in 2017 and 2018, has not gone along with the budget cuts that have been proposed by the Trump administration. And I think the United States, as well as European countries, the Nordic countries, the European Union, Canada, have been very, very generous in providing international support. Whether this is sufficient to transform rural Colombia, which is really, I think, what it's going to take to have a sustainable, over time, reduction and elimination of this kind of activity is really, open to question. Okay. Another obvious big drain on Colombian government resources is providing for the hundreds of thousands, some people say over 1 million Venezuelan refugees that have poured over the border into Colombia and sometimes through Colombia to neighboring countries, including Ecuador, Peru, also Brazil.
Okay, it sounds like a vast challenge is ahead. And sadly, I'm being told that discussion has gone much too fast for my liking. We're already out of time. But a sincere thanks to all of my guests who have joined me for this discussion. Mr. Raul Gallegos, Associate Director of Control Risks, a specialist risk consultancy. Mr. Jose Miguel Santamaria, Political Analyst in Colombia, also a member of that Democratic Centre Party. And Ms. Cynthia Arns, Director of Wilson Centre's Latin American Programme. That's where we're going to have to wrap it up for this edition. Do take care.